Savannah, Fall 2005. The front door slammed so hard the glass panes rattled, and a faint cloud of dust shook loose from the crown molding. Linda stood in the narrow Victorian hallway, one hand still resting on the doorknob, the other clutching the faded sweater Robert had left behind. Outside, she could hear the sharp click of his shoes on the porch steps, the car door creaking, and then the growl of the engine as it faded down the street. The house exhaled into silence, the kind of silence that is both a relief and a reminder of how alone you are. Linda was 60, sharp-witted but worn down by decades of keeping everything together, while Robert, ever restless, chased distractions. This time, the distraction had a name: Amanda, all of 30 years old, with legs that seemed to go on forever and a smile that looked rehearsed in front of a mirror. Robert had left a week's worth of backhanded remarks before finally leaving the house he called that old money pit. Linda knew his departure was inevitable, but the sting of the way he walked out, without even turning back, was worse than she had imagined. She turned slowly, looking down the length of the hallway. The place was tired, no doubt about it, worn wallpaper curling at the edges, hardwood floors that creaked like an old man's knees, and a staircase that leaned ever so slightly to one side. But there was character here, in every curve of the banister and every dent in the wainscoting. The tall windows, though streaked with grime, let in the golden Savannah light that seemed to soften even the most frayed corners. This house had been built for someone important, she thought, not for people who saw it as a burden. She made her way into the front parlor. The velvet curtains hung heavy and faded, the furniture mismatched from years of half-finished redecorating projects. Dust motes danced in the slanting light. On the mantel above the cold fireplace, an antique clock ticked quietly, the only sound in the room. Robert had hated that clock, always threatening to toss it, but Linda had kept it as a small act of defiance. By late afternoon, she had brewed herself a pot of tea and carried it to the wide wraparound porch. Carol, her neighbor and oldest friend, wandered over from next door with that knowing look she wore whenever she had news. Carol was in her early 60s too, but her energy could fill a room. She set down a plate of homemade cornbread and settled into the wicker chair opposite Linda. Without preamble, she leaned in and said, "You know, this house has stories. Back in the day, it belonged to a shipping magnate, name of Samuel Whitaker. Rich as you can imagine, but when the war hit, things went bad. Folks say he hid away part of his fortune right here before he died." Linda raised an eyebrow, half amused. She'd heard scraps of local lore before, tales of hidden safes behind false walls, buried trunks in the garden, but she had never taken them seriously. "Stories to keep kids from getting bored," she said lightly, but Carol's tone stayed serious. "I'm telling you, there are people in this town who still believe that treasure's here. Every so often someone comes snooping. Be careful who you let inside." The words lingered with Linda long after Carol had gone home. She sat there, sipping her tea as dusk settled over the street, the warm glow from the gas lamps pooling on the sidewalks. The air was thick with the scent of magnolia and salt from the river. Inside, the house felt different now. The silence no longer seemed empty, it seemed watchful. She wandered back through the rooms, touching the edges of door frames, letting her hand rest on the newel post at the foot of the stairs. It struck her that she'd never truly explored every inch of this place, not even after living here for years. Robert had always dismissed her curiosity, saying there was nothing worth finding in this old dump. But maybe that was just because he'd never cared to look. In the back hall, she paused by the door that led down to the cellar. She had been down there only a handful of times, mostly to store holiday decorations or fetch a jar of peach preserves from the dusty shelves. The thought of cold stone steps and the faint smell of damp earth made her shiver, yet she felt a flicker of something, curiosity or maybe the beginnings of a plan. For now, she left the door closed and returned to the parlor, lighting the lamp on the side table. Outside, a breeze rattled the window panes and the clock on the mantel marked the seconds. The house had been called a lot of things in the past few weeks: ugly, worn out, a waste of time, but in that moment, Linda saw it differently. It was old, yes, but it had outlasted more than its share of owners and scandals. It had secrets and she was still here to find them. She didn't yet know if Carol's story about the shipping magnate was true. But for the first time in a long while, she felt something other than loss. She felt the pull of a mystery waiting quietly inside these walls, and she had no intention of letting it go. The next morning, Linda stood in the narrow hallway staring at the closed cellar door. The memory of Carol's words from the night before nagged at her like a loose thread on an old sweater. She fetched a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, took a deep breath, and started down the steep wooden steps. The air grew cooler and damp with every step, carrying the earthy scent of stone and age. Her flashlight beam skimmed across shelves lined with dusty jars, a pile of rusted tools, and an old rocking chair missing one arm. In the farthest corner, partially hidden behind a stack of rotting crates, she saw something large covered by a tattered tarp. She pulled the tarp back and froze. Beneath it stood a heavy wooden trunk, darkened by time, its edges reinforced with tarnished brass. A massive padlock secured the front, its surface etched with scratches from decades of use. She knelt beside it, tracing the cool metal with her fingers. The initials, SW, were faintly burned into one corner of the wood. Samuel Whitaker, she thought, remembering Carol's story. For a moment she considered trying to break it open herself, but the lock looked like it could defeat even the most determined amateur. While Linda was staring at the trunk, Robert was across town in a rented condo with Amanda. At first, their new life together had been cocktails and takeout, weekend trips to Hilton Head, and late mornings in bed. But the credit card bills were stacking up. Amanda's taste for high-end boutiques and spa days didn't come cheap, and Robert's consulting work was thin. The reality of splitting rent, utilities, and her ever-growing list of essentials was starting to grind on him. Amanda was charming when she got her way, but her patience wore thin if the money talk dragged on. Linda, meanwhile, felt a strange lift in her spirits. The house was still old and creaky, but without Robert's constant complaints, it seemed to breathe differently. She began noticing the way sunlight pooled in the kitchen each morning, the sound of the river at night when the wind came from the east. She started small, sweeping the porch, trimming the overgrown shrubs, and found herself enjoying the quiet labor. Still, the trunk in the cellar called to her. Later that afternoon she walked over to the next street where Frank lived. He was in his 70s, wiry, with weathered hands and a slow, deliberate way of speaking. A retired Navy engineer, he had the kind of practical know-how you couldn't buy at a hardware store. She told him about the trunk and asked if he had any idea how to get it open. His eyes lit with curiosity and he agreed to come by. That evening, Frank knelt in the cellar beside the trunk, running his fingers over the lock. "This is old," he said almost admiringly. "Not your run-of-the-mill hardware store padlock. You know, in the 70s, the city had plans to bulldoze this place for a parking lot. Surveyors even came out. Then, poof, paperwork disappeared, project shelved. Some said it was politics, others, something else." His voice dropped a little on those last words, and Linda felt a shiver that wasn't from the cool air. Frank pulled a set of picks from a small leather pouch and worked in silence for several minutes. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed in the cellar. Finally, with a soft click, the padlock popped open. He set it aside and helped her lift the heavy lid. A wave of musty air escaped, along with the faint scent of old paper. Inside, stacked neatly on top, were several bundles of documents tied with brittle twine. The topmost bundle contained property deeds, letters written in ornate cursive, and a few faded photographs of stern-looking men in suits and women in elaborate gowns. Beneath the papers lay a small metal box, about the size of a thick book, its surface engraved with an intricate crest, interwoven vines surrounding an anchor, with a single letter in the center, possibly a W. The box was surprisingly heavy when she lifted it. Frank tilted his head toward it. "That's craftsmanship. Could be valuable." But Linda shook her head, closing the trunk carefully. "Not tonight," she said, a decision forming in her mind even as she spoke. She didn't know exactly what she had found, but something told her it wasn't meant for just anyone to see. After Frank left, she carried the metal box upstairs and placed it in the back of the linen closet behind a stack of blankets. The documents went into an old leather satchel she kept in her bedroom. She told herself she would go through them slowly in her own time, when no one was around to peer over her shoulder. For now, the house felt different again, as if it had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. Whatever secrets Samuel Whitaker had left here were hers to discover, and hers alone to decide what to do with. 2 weeks after Linda found the trunk, the first ripple of trouble reached Robert. He was at a downtown coffee shop meeting an old acquaintance, Paul, who had once done some light contracting work on the house. Between sips of black coffee, Paul mentioned, almost offhand, that he'd heard Linda had stumbled onto something interesting in that old cellar of hers. He didn't elaborate, but the word valuable was tossed into the conversation like a spark in dry grass. Robert left the cafe with a gnawing curiosity that quickly turned into something greedier. The next afternoon, Robert showed up on Linda's porch with a paper bag of muffins and an easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He claimed he had been in the neighborhood, and thought it might be nice to check in. Linda, who had not seen him in months, knew instantly that this wasn't some neighborly gesture. Still, she invited him in, offering tea and letting him settle into the parlor as if nothing were out of the ordinary. She watched the way his gaze wandered over the furniture, up the staircase and toward the back of the house. His questions were casual on the surface, how she'd been spending her time, whether she'd been doing any renovations, but each one felt like a fishing line cast into deeper water. At his condo that night, Amanda was less subtle. She leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed, and said, "If the place is still under your name, why not sell it? Old houses in that neighborhood fetch good money, especially if she's been fixing it up." Robert muttered something about timing and not wanting to cause trouble, but Amanda pushed. She had been losing patience with their increasingly tight budget, and the idea of a quick sale, and a fat check, had her attention. Robert started appearing at Linda's door every few days, always with some pretense. A basket of peaches from the market, a question about a tool he might have left behind, even an offer to help with odd jobs around the place. Linda accepted his visits with the polite detachment of someone humoring a persistent salesman. She never mentioned the trunk or the box, and when he made vague comments about restoring the place, or unlocking its potential, she only nodded and asked if he wanted more tea. Behind her calm expression, she could feel the walls of the house almost leaning in to listen, as though it understood the game they were playing. One crisp October morning, Linda was out front trimming the hydrangeas when two men she didn't recognize walked up the sidewalk. Both were in their 40s, dressed in work boots and faded jackets, with a kind of restlessness in their movements. One of them greeted her warmly enough, asking how long she'd owned the place. Before she could answer fully, the other cut in with a pointed question. "Ever heard the stories about a shipping magnate hiding a fortune here?" He said it with a half smile, but his eyes were sharp. They asked whether she'd ever done any digging in the yard, whether she'd come across anything unusual in the basement. Linda gave them a light laugh and said the only treasure she'd found in that house was a mouse nest in the attic. They didn't look convinced. After a few more strained pleasantries, they left, but she noticed one of them glance back at the house twice before disappearing around the corner. That night, Linda locked every window and door, even the seldom-used side entrance. The metal box was still hidden in the linen closet, and the documents from the trunk were in her bedroom, but she knew now that curiosity about the house wasn't harmless. If word was spreading about some long-lost shipping fortune, it wouldn't be long before more people came looking, and not all of them would knock on the door first. The next day she walked over to Carol's place, carrying a basket of muffins as a cover for her visit. In the kitchen, over coffee, she told Carol about the two men and about Robert's sudden string of visits. Carol frowned, set down her cup, and said she knew a good real estate attorney who handled complicated property cases. Within a week, Linda was sitting in a paneled office across from a silver-haired lawyer, explaining her situation. He listened quietly, then told her that as long as Robert's name was on any part of the property title, he could attempt to claim a share. The safest move was to have the deed revised so the house was in her name alone, airtight against any future challenge. The process was tedious but straightforward. Within a month, the paperwork was signed, filed, and certified. When she left the courthouse with the fresh documents in her bag, the weight on her chest eased. The house was hers, completely, unquestionably hers. Whatever lay hidden within its walls or under its floors would stay under her control. As she walked back along the tree-lined streets of Savannah, she felt the old place waiting for her, patient and silent, its secrets intact. Robert's visit stopped abruptly after the deed transfer, but the quiet didn't last. 2 months later, Linda received a thick envelope by certified mail. Inside was a notice that Robert had filed a lawsuit claiming the house was marital property and therefore, subject to division. He argued that because they had lived there together for years, it qualified as jointly owned, regardless of who was on the deed. Linda wasn't surprised, she had been expecting one last move from him. Still, the audacity of it tightened her jaw. The court date came on a brisk January morning. The courthouse smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, and the echo of footsteps bounced off the marble floors. Robert was already seated at the petitioner's table when she walked in, wearing his best suit, hair combed back, a picture of wounded dignity. He avoided her eyes, focusing instead on a folder in front of him. Amanda wasn't there, though Linda had little doubt she had been part of the push for this case. The proceedings began with Robert's attorney painting a picture of shared life and contributions to the upkeep of the home. He spoke about memories made under its roof, holidays hosted together, and years of joint investment in the property. Linda sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, letting him talk. When it was her turn, she stood and handed a bundle of carefully preserved papers to her lawyer, who presented them to the judge. They were the original deeds and probate documents she had found in the trunk. Proof that the house had been in her family since the early 1900s, passing through 3 generations before it came to her. There were notarized statements of inheritance from her great-aunt, all dated years before she had even met Robert. It was irrefutable. The judge reviewed the documents slowly, his brow furrowing. Then, in a calm voice, he explained that the house was Linda's separate property by virtue of inheritance and predated the marriage. Robert had never been a legal owner, not even partially. His claim was dismissed in full. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, sealing the matter. Robert's face was a study in disbelief. For years he had acted as though the house was half his simply because he lived there, and now he was hearing that, on paper, he'd never had a claim. He left the courtroom without a word. By the following week, word reached Linda, via Carol, that Amanda had packed up her things and moved out. Without the prospect of a big payday from the house, Robert was just another man with unpaid bills and dwindling savings. Linda heard through the grapevine that he had taken a small, shabby room above a laundromat on the edge of town. The rent was cheap, the walls were thin, and the single window overlooked a parking lot littered with shopping carts. The image didn't bring her satisfaction so much as closure. Back at home, the winter days passed quietly. Linda finally allowed herself the time to sit at her kitchen table and examine the small metal box from the trunk. The latch gave way with a little coaxing, and inside she found velvet pouches, each containing a gleaming gold coin. They varied in size and design, some with ships, others with ornate crests, and a few with dates from the late 1800s. She knew they were valuable, perhaps immensely so, but she also knew selling them would invite questions and attention she didn't want. For now, they would remain hidden, a silent insurance policy tucked away in her house's deep history. Spring brought a new rhythm. Linda hired contractors to repair the sagging porch roof, repaint the shutters, and refinish the floors inside. The garden, which had been a tangle of weeds, began to take shape under her care: rows of flowers, a small vegetable patch, and a neat gravel path leading to the back gate. Frank stopped by often, sometimes with a basket of fresh produce, sometimes with tools to help her with small repairs. Their conversations drifted easily from local gossip to stories from his Navy days, and she found herself looking forward to his visits. The house itself seemed to respond to the attention. Sunlight lingered longer in the rooms, the air smelled of fresh paint and blooming roses, and the creak of the stairs felt like the contented sigh of something old but cherished. Linda understood now that its value wasn't just in bricks, wood, or even the coins tucked away in her closet. It was in what she made of it, her own moves and countermoves, ensuring the place would never again be someone else's to claim. A full year had passed since the courtroom slammed shut the last door Robert might have had to Linda's house. The summer air in Savannah was thick and heavy, carrying the scent of magnolia and river water. Linda was on the porch one afternoon, trimming a pot of bright geraniums, when she saw a figure hesitate at the gate. Robert stood there, thinner than she remembered, his suit hanging loose on his frame and his hair gone almost entirely gray. In one hand he held a scuffed duffel bag, in the other a baseball cap he kept turning over like a nervous tick. His eyes darted up to the porch, then down to the ground. He cleared his throat and asked if she might let him stay, just for a little while, until he got back on his feet. Linda studied him for a moment, her mind flashing through all the years, all the arguments, and the smug way he had walked out. Then she smiled faintly and said the house was full up, but that the garden shed was empty if he didn't mind rough accommodations. The irony landed without her having to press it. Robert's mouth tightened, but he nodded and followed her around the side yard to a freshly painted shed that smelled faintly of cedar and potting soil. It had a cot, a chair, and a lamp, nothing more. That first evening, Robert wandered toward the back porch to thank her, and through the open doors he caught sight of the house as it was now. The peeling paint and sagging shutters were gone, replaced by deep green trim and polished brass fixtures. The porch rails gleamed white, the garden bloomed with roses and hydrangeas, and the gravel paths wound neatly between them. Inside, the hardwood floors glowed with fresh varnish, and the air carried the scent of lemon polish and fresh flowers. He saw Linda moving about in a light summer dress, her hair swept back, laughing at something Frank had just said. She looked younger, lighter, entirely at home in a place that seemed reborn. Robert never asked directly how she had managed to turn the old place into what it was now, but one morning, while fetching water from the kitchen tap, he noticed a framed article on the wall. It was from the Savannah Historic Preservation Society, praising Linda's donation of a remarkable collection of historic gold coins to fund restoration projects in the city. In exchange, she had secured a long-term agreement to open part of her home as a small private museum dedicated to maritime history. The city had handled much of the restoration work, and the museum's tours, event rentals and gift shop now provided Linda with a steady, comfortable income. The transformation was complete in every way. The house that had once been called a money pit was now a showpiece, with a plaque at the gate explaining its history. Tourists strolled by in small groups, pausing to take photos of the intricate ironwork and blooming garden. On weekends, Linda hosted small gatherings in the parlor, where locals shared stories about Savannah's shipping days over iced tea and biscuits. Frank was always there, lending a hand with guests or tending the garden when Linda was busy. Robert stayed in the shed for a couple of weeks, doing odd chores in exchange for meals, but the arrangement was clearly temporary. One evening, Linda mentioned casually that she would need the shed cleared soon to make room for new garden tools. He didn't argue. By then, it was obvious that whatever he had once been in her life was gone, replaced by something sturdier and far less forgiving. On the morning he left, the air was already warm and heavy. Linda and Frank sat side by side on the porch, sipping coffee and watching the sun burn through the mist. Robert came around the side of the house with his duffel slung over one shoulder. He didn't look up at them, just muttered something about fate under his breath as he headed down the street. Linda watched him go, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke softly, almost to herself, "This house, Robert, is only for those who know how to live in it." Frank glanced at her, and she gave a small smile before turning her gaze back to the garden. The hydrangeas were in full bloom, the bees hummed lazily from flower to flower, and the house behind her stood solid and bright in the morning light. She knew now that the true worth of what she had wasn't in the coin she had given away or even in the restored beauty of the place. It was in the way she had chosen to keep and grow it. The house had given back far more than it had taken, but only because she had learned how to care for it, how to protect it, and how to make it thrive. That, she thought, was the real treasure. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.